Our next speaker was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. He graduated in 1957 with a Bachelor of Science degree in physics from Holy Cross College. He then served on active duty as a lieutenant in the Marine Corps for 3 years. For 6 years, he was employed as an electronics engineer in New England. Mr. McManus joined the staff of the John Birch Society in 1966. In 1973, he was picked by Robert Welch to be the organization's public relations director and chief media representative throughout the United States, a hat he continues to wear to this day. He has appeared on hundreds of radio and television programs. He has authored several books, including Financial Terrorism, Hijacking America Under the Threat of Bankruptcy, Changing Commands, The Betrayal of America's Military, The Insiders, Architects of the New World Order, now in its 4th edition. Mr. McManus is publisher of the New American Magazine. In June of 1991, he was named president of the John Birch Society. He is married to the former Mary Helen O'Reilly of Boston. Together they have raised 4 children, now enjoying several grandchildren. Please join me in welcoming Mr. John F. McManus.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's a delight to be back in Idaho. I've been telling people that if you meet me at the airport, please don't say, "Hi, Jack." Bumper stickers make good reading, and actually most are slogans, and if you're a student of Robert Welch, you know how high a regard he had for the effectiveness of slogans, some of which were coined by the enemies of our nation. The slogan, "I like Taft, but he can't win," proved very effective in keeping a good American from gaining the White House quite a few years ago. Some slogans, of course, are designed to make us laugh, like the one I saw in an automobile that said, "Honk if you love peace and quiet." I saw another one the other day, and even though it smacked of irreverence, it made a very telling point. That the driver of the automobile was obviously upset about Black Tuesday. His bumper strip said simply, "Proud to be an infidel." I want to encourage everyone here tonight to put one of those Get Us Out strips on your automobile. Erect a billboard if you can. I understand there's a program on here down in Utah to have a billboard in time for the Olympics. Get Us Out billboard. That would be very appropriate. Good for you folks. Get yard signs. Get envelope stickers. Get Us Out is a catchy slogan, and it says precisely what America needs. Slogans are a powerful way of influencing public opinion, and there's no slogan more widespread dissemination needed than this one. People will ask you why. And of course, you can tell them, can't you? John Bircher should never gather an event like this without remembering the man whose foresight, wisdom, and determination brought us together. Looking back, we can easily wish that Robert Welch had been born a generation earlier so that he could have started the society in the 1920s instead of the 1950s. I know that he wished he had started earlier. If he had, the history of the past century would likely have been remarkably different. He would have pointed out to fellow Americans that a conspiracy was working to build a world government, that it sought to destroy the independence of our nation, that it was deadly determined to make captives of a once free people. But better late than never applies here, for he did start our organization in 1958, and we thank God for Robert Welch. One of his accomplishments, of course, is that he steered us to good information, some of which would never have become known if he had not started the dissemination. He helped us to know that World War I and our nation's fateful participation in it was supposed to propel all nations into the world government called for by Woodrow Wilson and Edward Mandell House. Their scheme didn't take because enough senators resisted when they correctly perceived that the League of Nations was an attack on our nation's independence. But the conspirators never sleep. Despite being set back, they arranged to punish the German nation and its people, thereby setting the stage for the rise of Hitler. They had earlier helped to bring the Bolsheviks into power. And the next generation of conspirators arranged for the United States to keep the Bolsheviks in business in Russia, even propel them to world power status. These same conspirators kept America in the throes of a deep economic depression for almost a decade, so that they could weaken our constitutional structure and convert many independent Americans into beggars at the government's trough. And then, after solidifying their gains in the mass media, in the educational arena, in many churches and elsewhere, they were able to maneuver our nation into another world war. They knew that another titanic and costly struggle would lead people to accept their main goal, a newer and even more sinister world government. Robert Welch often told us, war always leads to more government and moral decline. Very profound. We got the moral decline, but the main consequence of World War II wasn't a larger federal monster in Washington, it was world government. A world government sold to the American people as a way to do away with war. The new institution would end any need for their fathers, their sons, their brothers to leave home and take up arms. The idea had great appeal for millions who had lost a loved one during the war. The few who saw world government as a trap were very few indeed. Robert Welch saw what was coming because he knew the backgrounds of some of the early advocates of world government. He was enraged at the proposals of a man named Clarence Street, whose 1939 book entitled Union Now called for the United States to unite with Western European nations as the first step toward a world government. But back then, there wasn't any John Birch Society with members in the cities and towns of America to benefit from his awareness and to take part in a program to sound the alarm with fellow citizens and with congressmen and senators. Also in 1939, leaders of the criminally ambitious Council on Foreign Relations offered their services to the State Department. The offer was accepted, and CFR members have been in charge of this critically important division of government ever since. There were over 40 of them at the San Francisco Conference when the UN was founded, all committed to CFR founder Edward Mandell House's grand scheme. It seems likely that, like Mr. Roosevelt, CFR leaders knew the war was coming and knew why it was coming. And then after the Japanese attack, delegates from 26 nations gathered early in 1942 to issue a declaration of the United Nations, the first time the term appeared. By 1944, after numerous additional planning sessions, the initial drafts of the UN Charter were hammered out at a conference held at the Dumbarton Oaks Mansion in Washington. The document's chief architects were American traitor Alger Hiss, representing the Soviet Union secretly, and Vyacheslav Molotov, representing the Soviet Union openly. By the time the April to June 1945 San Francisco Conference started, the charter had been prepared and the Hiss-led conference approved it. During the war, some of our nation's leaders were working harder to create the UN than they were working to defeat Germany and Japan. It can be shown that they extended the war, even used the atomic bomb to make it worse. I can remember as a boy that day in May of 1945 when General Dwight Eisenhower proudly announced over the radio that victory in Europe had been achieved. But his announcement said, and I quote, "The forces of the United Nations are victorious," end quote. And the world body hadn't even been formed yet. Among the few who saw what the UN would mean for America, there arose a great statesman named J. Reuben Clark to tell all who would listen that the world body posed a danger to America. Unlike so many others, former Ambassador Clark studied the charter before the Senate approved it. He concluded that it would not only not prevent war, quote, he said, "It makes it practically certain we shall have future wars." Regarding the Constitution's grant of sole power to Congress to declare war, he stated that the UN Charter, quote, "takes from us the power to declare them," close quote. How right he was. Only 5 years later, the U.S. allowed itself to be dragged into a conflict in Korea without a declaration of war under UN authority. Over 50,000 Americans paid the supreme price in that struggle, called by President Truman a mere police action. But it was a war that they could have won on several occasions and it amounted to the first overt takeover, or at least a part of our nation's military. How many Americans realize that every soldier who has ever been assigned to South Korea during the past 50-plus years has served in the UN command? This outrageous arrangement exists to this day. Were any soldiers who agreed to serve and who swore the oath to defend only the U.S. Constitution ever given the option of refusing to serve in the UN command? No, they were not given any such choice. Therefore, every one of them was either the victim of a lie or was directly lied to. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. In 1919, the U.S. Senate considered entry into the League of Nations for 9 months and voted 49 in favor, 35 against, enough negative votes to keep the needed two-thirds majority from being achieved. Fast forward now to 1945 and realize that the Senate hearings about the new UN Charter began on July 9th and ended on July 13th, a mere 4 days. The Senate then approved the Charter on July 28th by a vote of 89 to 2. For me, July 28th, 1945, is much more deserving to be labeled a day that will live in infamy. How did it happen? Well, the horror of World War II and the need to do something to prevent future war had its effect on America. It was planned to have that effect. Not only was 1945 vote rushed through in almost record time, it was almost unanimous. Go back over that. 9 months they debated in 1919 and voted no. In 1945, 4 days, and they voted yes. 2 senators who voted against placing our nation in the UN were William Langer of North Dakota and Henrik Shipstead of Minnesota. Someday there ought to be a monument to pay them the honor they deserve because of their defense of the U.S. Constitution. One other senator, Hiram Johnson of California, later stated that he would have cast a no vote but was unable to do so because he was absent due to illness. And 4 others who weren't there later indicated their approval. So in effect, the Senate stood 93 to 3 for the United Nations. Your dinner program tells you that I consider the 89 who voted in favor of the UN to have betrayed America. Betrayal is a strong word. So let me tell you why I choose it. First of all, the UN's Charter, Article 25, states, "The members of the United Nations agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the present Charter. As a member nation, therefore, the U.S. is obliged to carry out the decisions of the Security Council." How can that be, you may ask, if what the UN wants conflicts with the U.S. Constitution, the supposed supreme law of the land? Good question, but practically no one asked it or even hinted at it. We must consider, and what I'm about to say should energize anyone who still loves this nation, we must consider the possibility that the UN already controls our nation, or at least controls our military. The UN authorized the war in Korea. Its Sito stepchild directed the war in Vietnam. The UN supplied the authorization for the war against Iraq. Under the UN, our forces in Somalia and Haiti were controlled. The UN's other stepchild manages our military in the former Yugoslavia. And after the UN gave President George W. Bush permission to launch action against Afghanistan, the U.S. sponsored a resolution at the United Nations seeking support from the other member nations. But the terrorists didn't steer planes into the UN building, did they? They steered them into American structures. And I've been delighted to see all the flag waving lately. It's a resurgence of patriotism we should take advantage of. But you can take advantage of it at least one way, by simply telling your friends, your neighbors, your co-workers, your family, anybody, isn't it wonderful to see all those flags flying and not one of them is a UN flag? Yeah. Our leaders are repeatedly giving us glimpses of continued sovereignty. It appears to me that they're playing a sinister game with us, not telling us the whole truth about the UN's dominance. Quite possibly the UN's actual control will be openly proclaimed when resistance to world government has either been completely broken or when resistance to the world government becomes futile. If this horrifying surmise of mine has merit, then resistance, already growing because of the efforts of the John Birch Society, must not only continue, it must grow. It must include many more Americans, and it must swell to a point where breaking free of the trap, withdrawing this nation from the United Nations, becomes, for politicians, the way to win an election. There are a couple of other reasons to support the choice of the word betrayal. A careful look at the UN Charter reveals its sovereignty-destroying aims, even its determination to make war to achieve peace. The Charter cleverly but deceitfully states near its beginning that joining the world body won't compromise the nation's independence. Listen to what they say, Chapter 2, Article 2, Paragraph 7. Nothing contained in the present Charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the jurisdiction of any state, or shall require members to submit to such matters to settlement under the present Charter. Doesn't that sound good, huh? For some, that overcame fears that the UN might become dominant. If the UN can't intervene in the nation's affairs, continued national sovereignty is assured, or so it seemed. But the rest of the very sentence I just read says this: but this principle shall not prejudice the application of enforcement measures under Chapter 7. They canceled it right out. In other words, there shall be no impediment to the application of the enforcement measures, local jurisdiction or not. Why didn't some senators object to that? And what are the enforcement measures it mentions? So we turn to Chapter 7 of the Charter. We read, the Security Council shall determine the existence of any threat to the peace, breach of peace, or act of aggression, and shall make recommendations or decide what measures shall be taken in accordance with Articles 41 and 42 to maintain or restore international peace and security. They never defined peace. What is peace? The UN Charter doesn't tell us. Like the communists who dominated its creation, the UN's definition of peace should be understood to mean the absence of opposition. Looking further into the Charter, we see that the aforementioned Article 42 says that the world body's enforcement action will include, quote, action by air, sea, or land forces as may be necessary to maintain or restore international peace and security. Such action may include demonstrations, blockade, or other operations by air, sea, or land forces of the members of the United Nations. Close quote. Isn't peace wonderful? To the UN, peace can even mean war. Let's summarize all this very quickly. Members of the UN agree to carry out the decisions of the Security Council. Lip service is paid to national sovereignty, but national sovereignty will be cast aside if enforcement measures are needed for peace. And the enforcement measures shall include action by air, sea, or land forces. In other words, if you don't submit to the UN's definition of peace, watch out. And the U.S., by virtue of membership in this Trojan horse, is committed to carrying out its decision. No senator, even the two who found other reasons to oppose entry into the world body, focused on this obvious threat. Some will say we have nothing to worry about because we possess a veto in the Security Council, but we must think about who will decide whether or not to use it. Bill Clinton, Madeleine Albright, George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell. Mr. Bush appointed Colin Powell to be his Secretary of State, and Powell was in office only a few days last January when at the UN he told reporters, quote, when it comes to our role as a member of the Security Council, we are obviously bound by UN resolutions, close quote. Oh? If we are bound by UN resolutions, the Constitution has been superseded. That's very simple. In saner times, Powell's statement would have prompted a nationwide outcry for his hide and for the man who appointed him. In 1945, in a totally illegal act, 89 senators put our nation in the UN. By doing so, they altered our structure of government. What they did amounted to replacing the U.S. Constitution as the supreme law of the land. Legal change of that kind can only be accomplished via an amendment, but the UN's promoters didn't seek to amend the venerable document. They knew that the deliberately lengthy process required for full passage of any amendment would give anyone time to discover the danger and derail the betrayal. And the vote of the 89 in 1945 was indeed a monstrous betrayal. Commenting on the terrorism of September 11th, President Bush has repeatedly made reference to the terrorists and those who harbor them as enemies of our nation. He has called the response to terrorism a war. It is, however, another undeclared war, and that can only mean it will be another no-win war, like Korea, like Vietnam, like the wars against drugs and illegal immigration. If our enemies are the terrorists and those who harbor them, what nations are guilty of harboring terrorists? Hasn't our own government officially designated as terrorists Syria, Iran, Iraq, Sudan, Yemen, and a few others? Yes. But these nations are given a place in the UN, aren't they? The UN harbors them. Doesn't it therefore follow that the UN, according to Mr. Bush's own criteria, is an enemy of this nation? It follows in my book of logic. But it obviously does not follow in his. If he were adhering to the oath of office and acting on his own assessment of the terrorism that befell this nation, Mr. Bush would be leading the fight to get us out. But don't hold your breath waiting for action from him. The pressure to get us out has to be applied to Congress, and especially the House of Representatives. The 89 who voted yes to the UN in 1945 have been succeeded by many more betrayers in the Senate, in the House, in the White House, and in lots of other places. The bowing and scraping before the UN continues, and it must stop. If the American people knew what the UN truly is, these betrayers would be looking for some other way to earn a living if they weren't on trial for treason somewhere in this nation. Whether or not there will be change needed to restore this nation's undiluted sovereignty depends on people like you who are here tonight. The test for an American isn't complicated. It should be administered to all our leaders. Are you for or against America withdrawing from this body? Will you work to restore undiluted independence to this land of the free and the home of the brave, or will you allow the UN to take over? That's the test. Gaining the right answers from our leaders is up to you and to me and to all who treasure truth and freedom. Don't expect the job to be done by anyone else. May your numbers increase here in Idaho and throughout this land. May your efforts produce success in this most noble of tasks. And may God help us all to make that slogan, "Get Us Out," resound from coast to coast.